with the session now. So this session is going to be divided into two parts. So I'll start the session and I'll review some of the data quality measures along with our data quality toolkit that we have available. And then I'll invite my colleague Jason up to the stage as well. And he'll talk about metadata assessments and a little bit of work and information on how you can have a look at the kind of health of your system's configuration. Okay. All right, so in the data quality part of this session, we're going to go through a couple different pieces of information. We're going to start with an introduction, just a bit of background on what's available in the data quality toolkit. Then we'll talk about some of the metrics that we have available. Some of the metrics we have are fairly new, at least in terms of how they're implemented inside of DHIS2. And some of the metrics are kind of the tried and true tested ones that have been available for some time. So I'll do my best to differentiate between what's new and what's been there for quite some time. And probably if you're familiar with DHIS2, you might be familiar with some of those measures. We'll also discuss the Data Quality Annual Report app. So this has been kind of built to replace some of the functionality found in the WHO data quality tool. So for anyone who's been using that previously, we had a function within that tool to create an annual report. Now we have a separate app, a new updated app that has been made in order to take many of those features and build upon those. And I'll demonstrate that. And then I'll discuss some of the implementation tools and considerations that are available for you to utilize. Okay, so we'll start with an intro. All right, so first I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of what the data quality toolkit includes. So we have a new set of documentation, and I'll open that in a second and walk through it with you, that gives you an idea of how to configure all of the new measures that I'm going to talk about, how you interpret some of those metrics and measures, and also how to utilize those in your own systems. We also have a demo that's been set up that you can log into. It's publicly available in order to view all of the various metrics that I'm going to discuss on a live DHIS2 implementation. We do have some of this configured, and I'll go through some of that and walk through some of that with you today as well. We have a couple tools as well that have that are available for you in order to help you kind of set things up or move things forward. So like I mentioned, we have this new annual reporting tool, new annual reporting app, I should say, that is in line with the WHO data quality framework. And we also have the script for generating minimum and maximum values. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's actually an additional tool. It's not on this list. I apologize. But there's a tool to also support some of the configuration of this because the configuration is quite heavy in terms of setting this all up. But once it's set up, it's all automated, which is nice. We also have a standard operating procedure template to help you kind of, get this actually implemented in your own settings, have an idea of at what various levels, what should people do in terms of reviewing data quality, what should be taken, what actions should be taken when you find an outlier, for example, or a value that's incorrect, and the idea is to give you an idea of where to start. It's not meant to adapt necessarily one-to-one in the country you're working in, but it's meant to give you some tools that you can utilize in your own countries, as a reference or a template and build upon that. Okay, so the data quality toolkit itself that we're focusing on largely builds upon what's available in the WHO data quality assurance guidelines. And that guideline is split into a number of different modules, right? So the one we're mostly focusing on is what we call the desk review portion, right? So this is the portion where basically the data has already been submitted and you can have a look at the data in your DHIS2, okay? A new part of this that we're introducing relatively soon is on the supervision aspect. So that's a different module within the data quality assurance guidelines. The supervisory tool is where you go down to the facilities and compare your data that's been collected in your system versus what's there in the actual registers, et cetera. Okay, so we are working on a tool for that, but for today, we're going to focus mostly on talking about the desk review portion of our data quality toolkit. Okay, yeah, I can skip this one. All right, so just quickly, for anyone familiar, it really looks bad on the screen, huh? So for anyone familiar with the previous WHO data quality tool, we are shifting and moving away from that. That is not receiving any more development support. So I know that there are some countries who had used that quite a bit in the past, but what we've done is basically move most of the feature set that's available within that WHO data quality app, and we've kind of built it into our own core DHIS2 platform. There's a number of reasons behind this. I mean, on large systems, for example, that WHO data quality tool didn't really scale well. So for example, I was doing some stuff in Nigeria, just crashed all the time. So we wanted to make sure that we got these metrics into our core so we wouldn't have the scalability problem. Also, so we could add everything to a dashboard. That was the other issue with the WHO data quality tool. It was just contained within that tool itself, and you weren't able to add those to a DHIS2 dashboard. So there's two areas right now where we don't cover within the kind of core tools. There's this very specific type of scatter plot, as well as the the generation of the annual data quality report. But we have an app, at least for this one here, the data quality report, we have an app built to deal with that. So while it's not in the core, there is an app that supplements the functionality to allow you to generate this report on an annual basis. And I'll show that. Okay. So what I want to do now is just go over some of the metrics that are available and just review them real quick. All right. So I'm going to walk through some of these and just display what they are. So any of these metrics that are starred, these are kind of relatively new, at least in the DHIS2 space. Okay. You couldn't really calculate them easily, I would say, previously, right? Some of the stuff is there from before. We had validation rules, we had min-max values, and you had your data set reporting completeness and timeliness available. But now we have a number of new metrics that you're able to calculate and review, once they're set up on your own system. And we'll spend a bit of time walking through that, just displaying what they are, explaining them a little bit, and show you some examples inside of DHIS2. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is validation rules. Now, many of you might be familiar with these, okay? But just as a quick review, right? So validation rules, they have a left side, a right side, and an operator of some kind. You can analyze them at the point of data entry. You can also analyze them as a batch set, for example, in validation analysis. You can perform, these are configured in your own system, right? So while we have a lot of references you can look at, you are able to configure these to your own needs. The nice thing about validation rules, they support various types of consistency. So you can look at internal consistency where you're just comparing variables, let's say they're collected on the same data set. But you could also compare internally collected data with data from some other source, as long as that data has been imported into DHIS2. For example, if you want to compare a certain data element with the same data element that's been collected on a survey, right? Maybe ANC1 coverage or ANC1 visits that's collected on a DHS versus an ANC1 that's been collected in DHIS2, okay? DHIS being the Demographic and Health Survey, okay? So you are able to use this in quite a different number of ways, but I'll just show some basic methods to explain, okay? So here's our tried and true data entry app, okay? And when we want to check validation at the point of data entry, we'll just click on Run Validation. Now, all these rules have been set up already, right? But if I have some basic checks at this point of data entry and it gives me some information back that I need to review, I can obviously go ahead and fix some of these if I need to. So this one here, I'm going to fix, and then it should remove that ideally. Now, ideally, you would have some SOPs, standard operating procedures, in terms of what you do when you encounter these types of errors or messages, right? And we know there are some limitations, right? Sometimes the data entry person may not always be able to change that data or fix that data. But the idea is to prevent as much kind of challenges kind of going up the system. And we'll see why that's important later on when I talk about outliers, et cetera. But the idea is to kind of be more preventative rather than reactive to these problems. So just real quickly, I'm gonna fix one of these. Okay, and run it again. Okay, there's still some errors. Didn't fix them all, but the one that was there has been fixed. So the idea is to try and reduce the amount of entry errors that are submitted from the point of entry as much as possible. Okay, okay. So doesn't like when I shift. Okay, so the other metric I really wanted to quickly mention is min-max. So this is something that's been around for a very long time as well, okay? And what we can do is basically define minimum and maximum values for every data element, disaggregation, and organization unit combination in your entire system. Okay. Now, there are issues doing this inside of DHIS2, and we really don't suggest that. We, however, have some prototype tools that we'll be actually testing next week in Lao to help you generate these minimum and maximum values to be much more accurate. So we're going to test that out and see if that's something we can basically help you guys with a bit more going forward. Okay. And I'll just touch on this real quick. Okay, so let's say I enter a value. Okay, so I've entered a value and maybe I just kind of entered a quick value and maybe I made a mistake when I was entering my data. It gives me a message that the number cannot be less than 0 or more than 100 as an example. So in this case, there is a maximum threshold of 100. What I can see, so this is the new data entry app for those of you who aren't familiar, just to quickly show it. Okay. What I can do, I can view the details of this field. Do this with one hand. Okay. Okay, and I can see that there's a minimum and maximum. Okay, there's a minimum and maximum set for this particular data element disaggregation and organization unit. So you can see here I'm entering data for MR1. It's less than 1 year for this particular organization unit. Okay, and that's why it's showing me this issue with the maximum value. So I could change this. Let's say it was supposed to be 24, right? Then I will no longer receive any error when I enter my information. Okay. And the whole idea is to generate all this information, not necessarily enter it manually. That will take ages and ages and ages. But if you're able to generate these minimum and maximum values and bring them into the system, this can really help once again with any kind of obvious error where a person's maybe hit their keyboard one too many times. It can help with correcting those types of things. Okay, so we've gone quickly over min-max and validation rules. And I just showed validation rules at the point of data entry. You can also analyze your validation rules in bulk, right? So this is the validation rule analysis. I've set everything up. I've selected my org unit, my dates, and what I want to run. I've also ticked this send notifications button, which you can have done automatically. There is a facility within DHIS2 to send out notifications when you detect a validation rule being broken, essentially. Okay, so I'm just going to run this quickly. I'll click validate, and I apologize, it's a bit hard to see on the screen. Okay, and it's given me my output. And for the parameters that I've set, I can see that there are a couple of validation rules. It's not an overwhelming amount, which is actually good. So I could probably go in and fix these pretty quickly. But the idea is that there are some values that need to be fixed. It gives me the organization unit. It gives me the period. I know the data set that it's associated with based on the messaging that I've received. Okay, and I've also received an email here. It's very hard to see, fortunately, nearly impossible. Okay. But I've received an email here that gives me what these validation rule violations are. And I'm able to schedule these. So I'm able to receive these directly. So if you have people who aren't regularly maybe getting into the system, so I have these kind of messages that I can send out in order to notify people of this. Now, you have to be very careful with these messages because you don't want to send out too many because then people will just start ignoring them and thinking it's junk, right? So you have to be very kind of meaningful with whom you select to receive these and how often they're sent out, etc. Right? You want to make sure it's just going to the right people who are going to follow up on this. So while there are a lot of tools, it doesn't mean you just kind of implement everything. You want some procedures, as I mentioned, to maximize kind of the value that's being achieved from these various tools. Okay, so now we can talk about some of the metrics that we have in DHIS2. Now, this is still kind of the old stuff, right? So min-max, validation rules, and data set completeness and timeliness. This is all stuff we had for a very long time within DHIS2, right? So none of this is necessarily that new. Right, so we have completeness measures that show us the completeness of our entire data set. We also have these timeliness measures, which are self-defined, depending on, let's say you say timeliness is 15 days after the end of the month for a monthly data set, and we can evaluate that as well. But there's a lot of issues with this metric, okay? Because it's just taking the entire data set as a whole, but you don't know what's happening with the values within that data set, right? So there are some new metrics that we've recently introduced regarding completeness. So we have one called data element completeness, and we also have one organization unit completeness, or maybe it's easier to understand, facilities consistently reporting, okay? So data element completeness, rather than looking at the entire submission of the data set, is just looking at individual data elements. Okay, so let's say I look at BCG doses. For the last 12 months, how many in that one facility did they report their BCG every month or not? And if they didn't, then there's a percentage of completeness that can be calculated. For this one here, facilities consistently reporting or organization unit completeness, this is also looking at the totality of various variables and how often or frequently they've reported within a 12-month period. You mark a facility as being complete if for the last 12 months, if they've reported every month, right? So let's say that facility is expected to report a value every month, right? Then did they or did they not for the last 12 months? Okay, so we have some examples of this on the dashboard here. You can see data element completeness for a number of data elements, IPv, DPT1, etc. Right? I'll go over this example a little bit more as well. Okay. And you can also perform some ad hoc analysis on this as well to just get completeness of, for example, an entire data set. I don't recommend putting that on your dashboard, but you can go into pivot tables, for example, and I can select all the data elements in my data set, and then I can make a chart, just quickly say, are they complete for this month in an ad hoc manner. This is more the automated analysis that is set up, maybe to do a review a bit more frequently. Okay, so. All right, so what I have is a table here with data element values submitted for DPT3. Okay, and I just want to clarify how some of these values are collected. Okay, so let's just highlight one row here. Okay, let's just highlight this one row of data. Now, if I'm evaluating data element completeness for any 1 month in this facility, it would be 100%, right? Because they've submitted something, right? Okay. If I look at the other metric, facilities consistently reporting, they would also be marked because they've reported a value for all 12 months, okay? So one value is just looking at a singular time period. The other value is looking at a span of 12 months, right? But if I look at maybe another facility here, okay. In this facility, we have 2 empty boxes, right? So their facilities consistently reporting. They wouldn't be marked because they're not actually reporting any data for 2 of the months out of that 12-month period, right? And their data element completeness for this month and this month would be 0, right? Because they haven't reported any data, even though they're expected to report data. Now, there could be a valid reason for that, right? Doesn't mean always that something's wrong. But typically, the idea is you select variables when you're doing this analysis that they're expected to report on every month. You wouldn't select variables ideally where there's kind of intermittent reporting happening, right? Yes.
Sir, I have a question over the data completeness. I mean, there are some situations like a facility cannot complete the total data set. Some of the areas are not related to his health facility, means EPI. EPI, if the EPI facility is not available in the that facility, but he has to complete the same form. So we have the same form. So his data is complete technically, but not completed. All the fields are not filled. How can you counter this? I mean, sorry, I mean, in DHIS, we had that this field is not applicable to me. If I click this option, then my data is complete. Is there any DHIS?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of data set reporting, there's not a whole lot you can do because everything's on the same form, right? But here you can kind of drill down and select specific variables that apply, right? And say, okay, every month at least, I know there should be data in these specific variables. And they could review those on a monthly basis, right? Because you're saying there's only certain variables that apply to them, right? And I guess that's kind of a broader group of users, right? Not just one user. Okay, so you can select those specific variables and maybe make a dashboard and say, okay, every month I know that these, let's say 5 core variables, there should be data, right? So at least let's review these 5 variables and see if there's data every month or not. And if there's not, then there's probably an issue and we need to check what's going on. So that's kind of a way to combat this issue with data set completeness, which runs into some of the problems you mentioned, like not everyone filling in the full form. Okay. Okay, so we've also introduced some new chart types. This is maybe if you're familiar with the WHO data quality tool, you would have seen this. So consistency of related data, we can use scatter plots. We can also use dropout rates for those of you who are familiar with that measurement. Okay. Okay, so here's an example of some of these scatter plot tools. There's not a really, I mean, some of these vary a little bit, but nothing really concerning, I think. Um, But these are kind of analyzing, two related variables on these scatter plots. And there's kind of a predictable pattern that should occur. In these examples, we have the one I'm hovering over is OPV1 and OPV3, right? So there's kind of an expected relationship between these two variables. And if the variation between the two is very high, then it'll kind of outline these. Now, there's a little variation going on here, but basically if anything's in these big boxes up top, and those require a bit more investigation in all likelihood. Right? We also have these dropout rate charts, and some of you might be familiar with this. You can apply them to several programs, right? We see some negative dropout rates. They're highlighted in red. Zoom in, okay? And generally speaking, these negative dropout rates over a kind of longer period are not really possible, right? So these would require investigation to understand why is my dropout rate negative, right? Because typically that's not really the case. Okay. Consistency over time, this is another metric that you'll see. We have these what we call year-over-year charts, okay? But they're basically just histograms showing, or kind of these kind of charts that are showing you previous year's progress and comparing them with one another. So you'll see this on this example dashboard as well. What these are really good for is pointing out very obvious errors in data, right? Where patterns are kind of consistent. So I'm just gonna hone in on one chart right here and open it up, okay? Now, there's a lot of lines here and it looks a little messy, right? Basically, one line represents 1 year of data. And we can see that and the bottom, the x-axis here, these are the months, right? But we can see there the data is kind of clustered together for the most part. But then up there, you have this point that's kind of away from all the data, right? It's very far away from the rest of the data and doesn't really follow the pattern. Probably some type of data entry error was made. Nothing sinister likely, but it's a pretty obvious error there. If I hover over it, I'll see. This is 28,000 for January 2020. If I find 2021 here, so the value is only 9,500 for 2021, right? So there's quite, it's someone's entered some data incorrectly somewhere, right? So you pull up a pivot table, you could kind of drill down, you could investigate the source of this, and you can figure out what's going on, okay? So anytime there's obvious errors, these really help. And you can set them up for a couple core variables as well, just so you can kind of quickly log in every month and determine the variation that's occurring. All right. Outliers is another area where we spent a lot of time implementing into the core feature set of DHIS2. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the WHO data quality app regarding outliers. The only problem was you needed to understand the terminology, right? It asked you to apply filters to areas such as Z-scores, right? It had both a modified Z-score and a regular Z-score. And if you didn't really know what that was and you started applying these filters, kind of got a little hard to interpret, right? So the idea is to identify these outliers to the person rather than them having to think through the math. Now we have some tools if you want to get into that detail and look at kind of the variation yourself and determine what's going on in a bit more kind of investigative manner. We do have tools for that, and I'll show those quickly as well. But the idea was, let's just show them what the outliers are so they can fix them, right? Let's show them the facility, let's show them the month, let's show them the value, then they can go and change it or investigate why it's so high or low. Okay. So we have a couple of various measures for determining or looking at outliers. So the first one we have up top is kind of these values called excluding outliers. This is the percentage of data for a 12-month period that does not have any outliers. Okay, and I'll open up a chart and I'll explain this more. So for example, we have a value here, BCG excluding outliers. It's saying 91.6%. So this means that 92% of the data for BCG is not an outlier, right? 8% of the data is an outlier. Okay. And what we've done is also create measures to give you a bit of a holistic look at this. So on this column here, on the right column here, BCG doses given, this is the actual amount of BCG doses recorded inside of DHIS2. Okay. This column here is the BCG doses excluding the outliers, right? So basically, if an outlier value is identified, we've removed it from the aggregation, and we're just showing you the data minus the outliers, okay? So to calculate this percentage, we take this column, divide it by this column to give you this value, okay? So that's how these work, more or less. And the idea is to give you some idea of how much are outliers affecting your data. Now, it's not too bad in this demo data here, right? In some live systems, can be a little worse, right? But here it's not too bad. It's fairly accurate. There are also kind of a number. So yeah. So what I was saying here, okay. So what I was saying here is to just give people the outliers so they don't have to kind of think about the math too much, right? And investigate why they're high. So this is actually a table that's just giving you the outliers that have been identified. So for this value, DPT1, September 24, we have this value of 198. It's an outlier and it needs to be potentially fixed. Maybe not for sure, but it's worth investigating, right? So the idea is just to give you those values and then you can investigate them. Now, if you do want to get into the math a little bit, how big I can make this before it doesn't want to play nice with me. Okay, so this is an outlier table. Okay, it's a new visualization introduced in DHIS 41. And this shows you basically, if you're familiar with the WHO tool at all, and you ran the outlier analysis, it would give you this table, okay? And what it shows you is the value, the median, right, which is the midpoint of the data set for all these values in this particular facility. It shows you the modified Z-score, right? This is a method of calculating variance, okay? The deviation, the min, and the max, okay? So if we have a look at this value, it's 854. The median value is only 9, okay? It's very low, right? So we have this huge kind of increase for the value that's been recorded for that particular facility, for that month, for ANC4, right? Chances are it's incorrect. It probably needs to be fixed, okay? So this is kind of a tool to help you look at these in a little bit more detail. And it's very easy to make. It's just a new visualization in DHIS2 version 41. We have this outlier table available in the data visualizer, and it basically allows you to really quickly build these tables. You don't have to input all the various statistical calculations. You just select your variable because the outliers are calculated by the analytics in the background. Okay. Okay. We also have this, so that kind of concludes the kind of core metrics in DHIS2. You can see there's a lot of new kind of potential measures or metrics you can implement to check your data. Of course, that's why we also have this SOP template to help with the implementation part of this, because just enabling all these tools, as neat as they might be, unless this data is kind of being viewed on a regular basis, then there won't be much happening necessarily with the data. Okay, we also have the Data Quality Annual Report app, and this is meant to fill that void of the WHO data quality tool, which previously generated a report for you. Okay, so we still focus on the measures that are within the WHO data quality assurance guidelines, right? Completeness and timeliness, internal consistency, external consistency, and consistency of population estimates. Okay, I think the easiest thing is to just show it. Okay. Okay, so this is the new version of the tool. It's available on the DHIS2 App Hub. It supported quite a few versions back, I think all the way back to 38 or 39. I'll double check, but it is there. Just with a couple clicks. So you do have to configure this tool. So just like everything else I've been showing, there's a lot of configuration involved at the beginning. So there's a bit of an investment, but once that configuration is done, everything is automated. So it makes it a little bit easier, right? You can just log in and view the dashboard, log in and make an annual report when you need to for the various metrics that you've covered. And it covers those domains that I talked about here. It's a lot of different information. Okay. One thing that's maybe interesting that we didn't talk about previously, this panel here, this is an external comparison of data, right? So here we have, it's a little hard to see. Okay, but it's comparing routine data from the EPI that's collected on a monthly basis with a demographic and health survey. So data has been brought in, okay, and it's showing the variance between these two data sources. This is something you can do in the core tools as well, but it's very nicely done within this annual reporting application, right? So the triangles, blue triangles represent the routine data that's in DHIS2. The red triangles represent the demographic and health survey data that's been imported into the system. And we can see that there is some difference in values at the different kind of levels of the system. Now with this report, you can also add in kind of your interpretation of all of this information because you are able to print it out later on, right? So there's a print button here. So once you add in your interpretations, you can print this out. You can either save it as a PDF or print it to an actual physical printer and get the printout, okay? And then you can disseminate that if you need to. Okay, so. Okay, so just real quickly, before I hand over to Jason, I'll go over some of the guidance we have available. So there's links to all of this in the presentation. So the guidance goes over a number of pieces of information for you. It discusses general principles around data quality. A lot of this is adapted from the Data Quality Assurance Toolkit. We talk about various features that are available in data entry, so validation rules, min-max, for example. All the analysis features, and there's quite a few. And there is also all the various parts of the configuration that we talk about. So unfortunately, the configuration is a little complicated, but we do have some tools, like I mentioned, that help you configure these. So you just kind of can click a couple inputs and it'll help you to configure these as well. Okay, but if you want to learn the kind of nitty-gritty details, we do have all of that available, as well as how to interpret all these measures. Okay. Another thing we've done is create a checklist to help you along in terms of preparing to implement this. So some of the things you need to talk about with the ministry, some of the measures you might want to decide on, talking about some of the configuration steps itself. We also have various toolkits and guidelines for this. So for example, here, we have a very long configuration document, but if you just want the summary of all the steps, we also have quick steps in terms of if you want to replicate these dashboards, etc., what you would need to do. The idea is just to give you a place to start. Like if you're wanting to implement this in your own country, how do I actually get started and get moving? I also mentioned this standard operating procedure template. Okay. And once again, this is not necessarily meant to be taken and used one for one in your country, but it's meant to give you some idea of what an SOP might include. And what we've tried to do here is outline at the various levels of a example health system. Obviously, the names for hierarchy levels in your own system might be different, but service delivery, health districts, regions or states, national level, what their responsibilities might be, okay? And then talked about some of the measures in terms of how often they're reviewed, okay? And some of it's a little blank because it's meant to be defined. We have some instructions that accompany this as well. Okay, and then lastly, we have a subnational checklist. So this is maybe meant to be deployed after you've done a training, let's say, and you want to follow up on if there's any type of behavioral change, right? Are they actually doing what you've asked them to do, right? Are they reviewing the data on a monthly basis? Are they checking the metrics that you've asked them to? Are they following the proper reporting procedures when they've identified an outlier or an incorrect value? Are they fixing those values, et cetera? Okay, so that's what this is for, just to kind of monitor if the training or the implementation that you performed is actually kind of proceeding the way you want it to. Okay, so the demo that I've showed all these features and everything, it's available on this link. This presentation is uploaded for you, so you can always access this. The login details are on the front page screen. You can log in, you can have a look. There's a couple dashboards that are configured there. Okay, and of course, if there are any questions or anything, I'm happy to help you out with over the next days that we are together and after this as well. Right? So I know that was a bulk load of information in a very condensed time frame. I apologize for that. Maybe I have time for a question or two before I hand over to Jason. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think it was very great. So I have two small questions. One, why in the data completeness in the data set, why the validation? How can we link the validation with the completeness? Because sometimes the data entry officer not validating the data, and if the data is not validated and they click on the complete, so the data is completed without validation. One, another, I don't know. I think I missed it. How to fix a min and max value to be implemented for all the months they are reporting for all the type of facility. Yeah, so thank you.
Sure. So, okay, yeah, the validation rule one is tough because when they, yeah, right, as of right now, you can't stop them from completing the data set if they haven't run the validation checks as of right now. I don't know if that's something we're going to change. The challenge that we have in terms of adding that as a generic feature is that there are many instances where they can't fix the value. So even if they run the validation rules and we don't allow them to submit, they can't fix the value. So then the data set never gets completed or submitted, depending on the workflow. So I don't know if it's something we'll support generically. It is probably something you can do as a custom modification, but supporting that generically might be tough on our end. I can talk to my colleagues and see if that's something we'll think about for sure. It's good feedback. But as of right now, I know we don't support that. For your next question about the min-max, yeah, so okay. First thing I would say, DHIS2 has a facility for generating all this, but like I said, don't use it. It's not helpful. It'll give you incorrect values. We have a prototype tool that we've developed to create min-max values for all your facilities, across your hierarchies, across all your periods. We're testing that actually next week in Lao, and we're going to see how it goes. And if that's something that works, we're going to release it for the public, and they can use that to help them generate min-max values. But for now, yeah, I guess just wait. But we'll hopefully have some more information within a month or two after we've tested it in Lao and can share that with you. But yeah, unfortunately, the facilities inside DHIS2 don't really work very well. So I recommend not using that. You can either use a statistical tool outside of DHIS2 or wait until we release this application. That would help you make those minimum and maximum values. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I think I'll hand over to Jason. If there are any other questions, please feel free to grab me at any time. I realize it was a lot of information. But yeah, we'll hand over to Jason and he'll talk to you a bit about how you can assess your metadata.
I think so. Yeah. All right. Let me see if I can get this away. Okay. So I think we're almost there. Get rid of this thing here. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Pickering. I work with the global implementation team. And today we're going to talk about the brand new metadata integrity checks that we've developed recently. We spent quite a lot of time on this, working together primarily with other members of the implementation team and the development team to redo a lot of the metadata integrity checks. There's also some checks on data as well. Some of you may have used this feature in the past and probably had issues with it. You may have even crashed your server with it. It was very slow and often didn't work in very large instances. So we've done a lot of work cooperatively between the implementation team and the DHIS2, both the backend as well as the front end team, to completely redo this part of the application. And I think it will be very useful for many of you. So yeah, as I mentioned before, the previous integrity checks were all Java-based. They were frequently very non-performant and very memory intensive. This really depended on your system. You know, if you have a very small system, they probably work fine. But in many very large instances, and particularly old systems, and by old, I mean systems that have gone through many upgrades over the years, we often saw issues, both in terms of load on the performance and some cases even crashing the entire system. Another big problem was that, sorry, it was not possible to selectively run individual checks. So if you were only interested, and this was often the case, you might only be interested in running a particular check at a time, because if you have like 50 different problems with your metadata in the system, you can't address all of them at the same time. So oftentimes you might be looking at organization units without coordinates, and you don't want to have to rerun all of those checks all over again. You might be only focusing on that specific problem. So that was a big problem. There was also what we've seen over the years, and as we've worked with a lot of countries and other organizations that are using DHIS2, there were a lot of checks which were missing, a lot of problems that people had told us about, things that needed to be checked, which weren't implemented. And this was quite difficult because it was all written in Java. We needed to get a Java developer. It needed to go on the roadmap, and it became very laborious for us to implement these types of checks when we found them working with you guys, for instance. So as I mentioned, in version 40 plus of DHIS2, we've completely rewritten all of basically the entire subsystem. For the most part, there are still a number of these integrity checks that are Java-based that we cannot rewrite in SQL. At least I can't. It's not very straightforward to do this. So some of them we've left in Java because we need to, but the vast majority of them have been rewritten using SQL, and so they operate directly on the database and tend to be very, very, very quick, certainly much quicker than they were before. We also wanted to make these relatively accessible to database administrators or DHIS2 administrators. So we wrote them in a format called YAML, which is, some of you may know this, is yet another markup language. It's similar to JSON, similar to kind of a web-based format, but it's a little bit more user-friendly. I'll show you an example of one before. They're sort of human readable if you're familiar with databases. It may not be for everybody here, but we did want to intend it at least for people that are familiar with executing SQL queries on the database. And so instead of having to go through the front end, it might also be something that a database administrator or DHIS2 administrator could do directly on the database. And that could also speed the process up a little bit. Another really great feature that one of the backend developers had suggested was extensibility through custom checks. And so we have written 60 plus or so metadata integrity checks that we believe are basically applicable to all DHIS2 systems. This is sort of opinionated, and we certainly would value your feedback on whether you think that it's applicable to your system or not. But we know that there's definitely also a need for implementations to include metadata integrity checks that are specific to their specific instance. It may not be applicable to everything. A good example of this would be data element naming conventions. So you may have established a certain way of naming your data elements. I also know that a very common practice in the past has been to append the, let's say, province code to the name of the organization unit. That was very common in Southern Africa and in DHIS 1.4. It's another naming convention, and there's no way necessarily to enforce that with DHIS2, but it may be something that you want to check in your own instance. And so there is a way basically for system administrators to create these custom checks that may only be applicable to your particular instance. That's not necessarily applicable to everyone. If I'm going too fast, something isn't clear, feel free to stop me and ask any questions. We gave a much longer workshop on this a couple of months back at one of the academies in Addis. I did want to include this slide though, because I think it helps to give us a bit of context into what some of the root causes of metadata integrity issues are. These checks only help you to identify them. They don't necessarily, from a sort of technical perspective, what they don't do is to help you to address necessarily all of these problems, right? We wanted to give you a tool to help you to easily identify them in your system. But there's many other factors that you may need to consider in terms of why these certain metadata may be considered to be invalid or problematic. One of them, of course, is the change in the DHIS2 metadata model over time. So as the system has evolved, There have been changes, various changes to different types of metadata organization units, data elements, indicators. So particularly if you have a database that is, say, 5, 10, 12 years old, you may have gone through many upgrades over time. And what used to be valid may not be valid anymore, basically. Or you may be missing something in your database. So some of these checks will help to identify those issues. If you're running a very new instance, something that you created over the last year or two, you may not suffer from this type of problem. I don't really know what I meant by changes in the DHIS2 instance over time. Maybe I'll think about what that is. One key problem is the weakness of the validation during import. So there are many things that the metadata importer doesn't necessarily check for. I think a good example of that would be the naming convention. So let's say that you're creating a new data element and you've decided that it should have this specific naming convention. The generic DHIS2 metadata importer doesn't know anything about that naming convention, basically. So over time, these types of issues may add up. There are many other weaknesses basically in the importer. A lot of that has been improved, particularly over recent releases. It's gotten a lot better, but it's still, there are issues, particularly between metadata objects, where relationships between certain objects may not be caught once you've imported the metadata into the system. Another sort of systematic, this doesn't really have anything to do with the software per se, but a lack of standard operating procedures and how metadata is managed. What we've seen in many instances, particularly ones that have been running for a long time, is that there's a lot of cobwebs in the corner, if you will. There's a lot of like dust that is collected over the years. And so there is kind of a tendency to add new data sets, add new indicators, add new dashboards, but perhaps less emphasis on cleaning up the old stuff that is no longer used, or worrying about how do we migrate our old metadata to our new metadata. And so this can have an impact in terms of system performance. As you collect more dashboards, as you collect more users, more metadata objects, that can have a deleterious impact on performance. Unfortunately, we've also seen in many cases where there's been experimentation or training which has been conducted on production environments. This is, of course, something that we would strongly discourage and would definitely recommend that you should always use a development, testing, production type of workflow where all of your changes and experimentation and training are made in something other than production. But we know that in many cases, that may be the only instance that you have. So you may train people, ask them to create a dashboard, and then forget about cleaning it up. And 2 or 3 years later down the road, you've done more training, and you end up with 10 or 20,000 dashboards that are never used. So those are the types of things that you may need to think about in terms of managing your metadata over long periods of time that, you know, this dust and cruft tends to sort of collect. Yeah, I think there's many other reasons why this can happen, but these were some of the ones that I wanted to highlight in terms of how these metadata issues actually arise over time. Actually, in version 40 and even in version 39, we had pieces of the backend system in place. But thanks to our front-end colleagues, they implemented a new app or a new part of an app in the data administration module to allow you to basically utilize the metadata checks. So I'm going to give a demo here in a minute, but this is basically how it looks like. It's part of the data administration module. We've got the individual checks that are listed here, and then there's a lot more detail. We'll go through the demo in a minute, and hopefully it will make more sense. The metadata integrity checks, they always consist of a summary and then individual details. We wanted to give, let's say, an overview. We wanted to give system administrators an overview of what's going on. So instead of being able to be overwhelmed with so many different issues. Can we just give you a big overview in terms of what are the big problems in the system or potential problems? So the summary really just consists of the number of problems, metadata objects that have been flagged. And we've also included an opinionated level of severity. And how do we determine, what do we consider to be an error, critical, warning, and info? We made a best guess. Certain things, from our experience of having done this for quite a number of years and in consultation with the development team, certain issues are a lot more important. For example, we have one check for organization units with trailing spaces. So these are spaces at the end of the name of the organization unit. We know in the past that sometimes people do this in order to distinguish between two different organization units that do have the same name. And in previous versions of DHIS2, it wasn't possible to have an organization unit with the same name. Now that's changed. You can have an organization unit with the same name. But in the past, people may have tried to distinguish this with trailing spaces. The problem with that is that when you get to analysis, it can become very confusing to know which one of these organization units am I dealing with, because I can't see the trailing spaces. Now, this is not a critical problem. It's not going to cause a system failure. It's not going to cause, potentially your system to crash. So we tried to assign basically a severity to give you some idea in terms of what is the level of criticality of this issue as opposed to that issue. In addition to the summary, then we also provide a detailed listing of every single metadata object which corresponds to a particular problem, so that you can really drill in and see, okay, I found an organization unit with a trailing name. How am I going to fix this? There has been a best effort approach to link to the individual object, and I'll show how that works in the user interface. This doesn't always work, though, because it may not be the object in question that's the problem, right? You may need to fix something else in order to actually fix the problem. So we've tried to give you a way to get to the problem, but in many cases, it may not be possible through the maintenance app to actually fix it. Yeah, I mentioned this extensibility through custom checks. I'm not going to go into the technical details of how to do this. It is documented for those of you that are interested or that want to pass this information on to your system administrators about how to create these custom checks. But in general, some examples that I came up with that may be specific to your instance, or you can really dream these up, right, for yourself, would be ensuring that all users have valid phone numbers. I know that in certain cases, a lot of system administrators are interested in being able to contact individual users. This might be to begin a WhatsApp group, Telegram group, send out SMS reminders. There can be many reasons why you might want to have a user's telephone number or an email address. We didn't feel that implementing those types of checks was possible for the core because it's not applicable to all DHIS2 instances. But for your particular instance, you may have certain rules that you want to enforce, basically. So can you create a check to say, okay, I've got 50 users that don't have an email address. I need to follow up with those users, figure out what their email address is, and then input it into the system. A lot of this work came out of the work that we did with PEPFAR on their DHIS2 instance, and specifically around the configuration of certain metadata objects and how they're related to each other. So in the PEPFAR instance, they had very specific ways about how users and user groups should be configured and users. So users should have a particular role, they should belong to particular groups. And so there was only a certain way of doing this, basically. Again, this was one way. This is nothing that we could implement in terms of a generic check because it's very specific to a specific DHIS2 instance. But through this extensibility, we wanted to give system administrators a way to basically implement it yourself using SQL. So you need to be able to have someone or yourself to write that query. They're not that difficult, and I'll give an example of one, but it's a lot easier than having to write Java and get it included in the core of DHIS2. So it does give you a way to extend the functionality of these metadata checks without having to get this necessarily integrated into the core of DHIS2. I already talked about the naming conventions. That's another kind of good example. If you have a specific way of naming your data elements or organization units, what have you, you could also create a check to check for all of the data elements that don't correspond to the your particular naming convention. Another example would be looking for facilities that don't have coordinates, right? Again, that wasn't a check that we could include in the generic DHIS2 software because we don't really know if all instances should have coordinates or not. But for your particular instance, you may have a policy in place to say, yeah, we need coordinates for all of our facilities, and we won't have a way to flag those that don't have them and follow up and get them. Yeah, demo time. Any questions before I move on to the demo? All right. So I'll just log in from, let's see, I was on this one. I just chose an instance here, and I did mention that this was available through the data administration. So we can go to data administration, and now this is part of the, I'll zoom in a bit here. So this is not a separate app, but it is part of the data administration module now. So obviously users are going to need access to that. This is not intended to be used by end users, right? Like say data entry staff. This subsystem is really meant for system administrators primarily, right? So that's why it was included as part of the data administration module, since it's really more intended for user administrators. This was what I showed you before. And all you have to do is come in here. All of the ones which we think are fast, and again, this is opinionated, but is based on sort of experimentation and experience. We wanted this to be very quick, right? We did not want you to have to wait for 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes to generate these checks, basically. So you can see I ran all of these, 60 or 70. I don't exactly know what the number is at the moment, but it ran almost instantaneously, or very quick anyway. And all of the ones that are checked with green basically means that nothing has been flagged, right? We didn't find anything that corresponds to a potential problem. This one, on the other hand, category option groups should have at least 2 members. Now, one of the things that we want to make clear in terms of this is that this will require some thought on your side to see if this actually is a problem, right? And in many cases, it may not be a problem, but we did want to flag potential issues. And so it may be quite okay to have a category option group with only 1 member. But part of the reason of using category option groups is to take multiple category options and group them together. So if you only have a category option group that has 1 member, it might be okay, but it might not be. So that's important to keep in mind, is that in many cases, this will require you to sort of triage the issue and determine, is it really an issue? It has been flagged, but it may not necessarily be an issue in all cases. And what do we mean by this? Yeah, so in this case, I think this is a good example, and you may not be able to see it. But I think the issue here is that this particular category option group only has 1 member, 0 to 1. And that may be totally okay, right? Because you may only have an age band 0 to 1. But in other cases, if you're looking at, say, less than 15 and over 15, you probably want to combine multiple age groups into one. So that's kind of the point of this check. But I just wanted to point that out, that, you know, you do need to think about this a little bit, that we're not necessarily trying to say that everything that's up here is an error. It does require some thought. It will require you to think about, is this a problem in our instance or is it not? We'll scroll down and maybe find one. Aggregate data elements not in any data element group. And I can't get rid of that. Let's see if I can get rid of that. Show more. Make it a little bit smaller. We've also tried to include the severity that I mentioned. The section is kind of related to, like, is it a data element? Is it an organization unit? What are we dealing with? We describe what this check is about. And this basically says all data elements should be in a data element group. Why should all data elements be in a data element group? Yuri?
Dimension rather than each individual data element. I think
You did. I put him on the spot. Yeah, I mean, one like really key reason is in the data visualizer, right? When you select data elements, you select a data element group, and you want to filter by a data element. If you don't have a data element in a data element group, it can become very difficult to find it, right? So again, this isn't necessarily an error, right? This doesn't cause your system to crash or, cause a problem per se. But, Yuri pointed out some reasons about why you want to do it. There's also just a very straightforward reason for end users. If they're looking for, let's say, looking for general population, they go into the pivot table app, or sorry, the data visualizer app, and they can't find it because they look in the, population data element group, but this data element doesn't show up. So these can also be usability issues, basically. We've also included recommendations in terms of how to solve this problem. Data elements that are not in a data element group should be added to a relevant data element group. If the data elements are not needed, they should be deleted. That's also a possibility. Yuri's got another comment. I'll take it in a moment. But it can also be, in many cases, again, coming back to experimentation, right? Maybe somebody's added a data element temporarily, but they didn't add it to a group, right? It's just like they add something, but it's not really part of anything. So it might also get flagged here, right? Yeah, Yuri, while I'm pulling up. Okay, sure. Let me finish this and I'll come back to it at the end. Yeah, I'll try and answer it in a moment. I just wanted to show this kind of linking feature that we've included and say why it works sometimes and why it doesn't work in other cases. So what the front end guys did for us is that we linked to the maintenance app, you can see here. And then I go to the data element. The problem is I can't really fix this problem here, right? This is related to the data element, but the actual problem is its relationship to a data element group, right? So you'll see that sometimes this will work, sometimes it won't work. We'd love to hear feedback in terms of maybe how we can improve upon that feature. But for now, we've given a kind of best effort approach to link to the particular metadata object so that at least you can see what is this metadata object. I need to flag it, I need to follow up and figure out what I need to do with it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to work. For Yuri's question, they can't hear me? Yeah, Yuri's question was related to how do we delete data elements that, like in this particular case, let's say I've experimented with and maybe we can just do it, right? We'll add a new data element maybe. And we obviously, I just wanted to show how quick that we can do it. So if we add a new data element here, test data element. And I think we need domain type, let's say aggregate. I think that might be enough, huh? Okay, now we go back to our data integrity check, and we're gonna rerun this, I think. I thought I could run these. Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought that we had done that. You can say that I ran all of the checks, but we also wanted to give you a way basically to run individual checks, right? A way to sort of look and say, can I rerun this particular check? And now you can see that it may not be completely obvious here. But you can see this is the one that I just added here. Test data element, right? So instead of having to run all of them at one time, it's also possible to simply say, okay, I'm going to focus on this particular problem. And I'm not going to worry about all my other problems, but I'm only going to focus on this. So then how do we deal with this problem? Well, we can go back to the maintenance module and we can go to data element groups. And I don't know, let's just say that we put it in malaria treatment and we find our test data element. And we hit save. And now we can go back to the data administration module and data integrity. And we can find data elements not in any data element groups. So we can find that one again. And we can only rerun this specific check. So we don't have to rerun everything. We're only focusing on this particular problem right now. And now we can see that that flag data element has now gone away, basically, right? So, yeah, I'll get to your question in a minute. So that's basically the workflow that we were thinking, right? Is that sometimes you can fix these manually through the user interface. In many cases, you're not going to be able to fix it through the user interface. And that's where part of where Yuri's question comes in. And Yuri asked, how do we get rid of a data element that has data? Right? Was that your question, Yuri? Yeah, so in certain cases, you may need to get rid of like a duplicative data element. Maybe someone has created a duplicate by mistake and there's been data that's been entered into it, and you want to get rid of that. Yeah, we don't have like, unfortunately, what I would like, the feature I'm dreaming up here is like a button that says fix this issue. We don't have that button right now, and we don't really have a direct solution for the problem that Yuri highlights is, how can we fix it? How do we get rid of this data element? I do believe that the backend team has now developed a feature for merging data elements. So you can take and let's say you have this data element and you want to merge it with another one, similar to organization units. So I think those types of features are in progress now to deduplicate metadata objects. Yeah, right now, I think the only solution is that you're going to have to go into the backend database system and fix it yourself, right? That's the solution right now. But we do want to improve on the tools that we have to help implementers and system administrators to solve these types of problems. There was a question in the back. Maybe we get a mic so that our online participants can also hear the question. Here, I'll just come to you.
Yeah, and which option which version is available?
Yeah, so yeah. So this user interface is available only in version 41 and higher. We do have some solutions in lower versions, particularly version 40. There is an app that was developed by, don't look, I'm not going to admit to it. Yeah. But there is a very basic app in the App Store for version 40. Don't laugh if you're a JavaScript developer. I did the best I could. But the front end guys are a lot better at this stuff than I am. But for version 40, the back end checks are there. So these checks are available through the API, and there is a really basic app that's available in the App Store. So if you're on version 40, you should be able to use that app. Version 39, there's very, very few of the checks that are included. So we didn't backport all of that to anything below 40. So yeah, 41 for the nice new shiny user interface from the front end team. Version 40, there is in the DHIS2 App Hub. Let's see if I can find it. Metadata. Yeah, it's this metadata integrity app that should work on version 40. Yeah. Was there another question in the back? Not Yuri, but I thought I saw a hand. No. Okay, Yuri.
The reason I asked the question, and also since we were talking about the data element groups, I mean, you just generally want to keep your workspace organized, and having, let's say, a data element group for those elements that you want to delete or anything else can also help you gather that and then give them to the administrator and say, get rid of those from the database. So it's data element groups. We use them in the core team also to help us extract metadata and move it from one instance to the other. So it's just also the matter of organization of your daily work.
Yeah. I think we're out of time. I'm actually 2 minutes over. So I think we'll leave it there unless there's any last questions. Yeah, take the last question.
Up to now is fine, but the thing is, you have said about custom integrated check. So do you want to show you later on?
Yeah, I'll show this really briefly. I will refer you to the documentation. Let's see. You can actually look in the source code, and of course, displaying the source code on the screen is not great, but I did mention this YAML syntax, yet another markup language. And basically, how you can do this for custom integrity checks is you need to follow this pattern. So if you go into and you read the documentation, you go and see, you know, we need a name, we need a description, a section, a summary SQL, details SQL. So basically, all of these things need to be done exactly as we have done it in the core. The SQL query needs to be written in a certain way. It needs to return data in a certain way. But we have documented how to do this. I think it's pretty straightforward, really, particularly if you're comfortable writing SQL queries for DHIS2. This isn't really particularly complicated. And then those can be, they need to be put in a particular directory in your DHIS2 home, and you restart your server and they will become available via the user interface, basically. But I'll leave the details to the documentation. If you want to talk one-on-one about maybe experimenting with your database and you have some ideas for your custom checks, I can also help out while we're here. And please, if any of you, once you get a chance to check this out and have a look, if you guys have ideas for new checks, things that we're missing, we've got a lot of suggestions from implementers in the field, DHIS2 administrators that have been working with DHIS2, things that we haven't thought about. We can always try and include those into the core checks. So please feel free to feed back to me. You can find me at jason@dhis2.org. If you have ideas for new integrity checks, or in certain cases, people have found bugs in the ones that we have implemented. If you're checking your database and it doesn't work the way that you think, then please feel free to feed back to us, since all of this is relatively new. Great. I think we're out of time, actually a few minutes over, but I'll turn the floor back over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, and to Nick, who's presenting in another room right now. So we will have our tea break now. So our tea break will be 30 minutes. So we will start our next session at around 3:30. So in this room, the session will be about integration. So if you want to go to the session on visualization tools, please go to another room after your break. So yeah, you can take your break now.